afternoon, persons of quality, and welcome again to a Canterbury Tales Geoffrey Chaucer Knight's Tale lecture, helping you to fill in the gaps in case you are struggling with your reading. So here, of course, is my text. This is part 2. So we've already had a chance to look at Theseus, taking a look at Palamon and Arcita, and their unrequited love of Emily. Now, as I sit and I think about how I would structure my notes on this, I'm going to think medieval romance. I'm going to think about how Chaucer is satirizing and going out of his way to mock and overdevelop medieval romance, the code of chivalry, and how our two rather immature boys fail in their sort of portrayal of these particular ideas. Now, I did go through again and take all kinds of notes here in my text. And if you remember, like it says here, you're going to see a little bit backwards, but it says that emotion is a flaw because these boys get way too concerned and way too overdeveloped in their love of Emily and the fact that she doesn't even know that they exist. So there's a lot of these things. So if I turn to page 40 in the text, as we're talking about how these boys go out into the world, and this is about 8 lines down, it says, not merely like a lover on the rack of Eros, but more like a maniac in melancholy madness, under strain of fantasy. So characters, and again, here's a perfect manifestation of how characters are driven by emotion, incredibly stupidly. And again, we use the term melancholy, which certainly would apply to the knight and how we really are going to develop his particular character. So I think these things are, again, a good way for us to look at what's going on. I also wrote Deus Ex Machina in my notes on the margin. So as these characters are sort of slaves to the plot, they are driven by elements beyond their control, it becomes a significant idea. As we continue down page 40, it talks about the winged god Mercury, he thought, came near and stood before him, bidding him have good cheer. His sleep imbuing wand he held in the air. He wore a hat upon his golden hair, arrayed, Arcita noticed, in the guise he wore when closing up the 100 eyes of Argus. Again, this is on page 40. You boil all this down into the simplicity that Arcite is dressed, I'm sorry, not Arcite, the god Mercury is dressed as a shepherd. Now, this recurring theme of characters in disguise, pretending to be people that they are not, is really a significant motif that we're developing throughout Chaucer. This need to disguise who you are, to hide the passion when you're emotional, to hide the logic when it's driving you out of control. So this element of disguise becomes incredibly important. I turned the page in my text so I can look at what I wrote inside. If you look again at the bottom of page 40, we have Arcita becoming resolute. He's convinced of exactly what he's going to do because the gods tell him to do it. We remove the necessity to make our own choices. We remove any of those kinds of things because the gods, quote unquote, are telling us what we need to do. Notice how many times in the Knight's Tale Chaucer references the Greek gods and the roles that each of those gods play in the overall development of the story. So I find all these things incredibly important. So as we're specifically drilling down and taking a look at these characteristics of medieval romance and how they're really mocked and satirized in the Knight's Tale, I think it's very important for us to look at a couple of these traits again. Now, this is just recapping what's in your notes. The wording may be slightly different, but it is absolutely portraying details that you're going to need to know to look at what Chaucer's doing in parts 2 and parts 3. So I specifically look at this, and so the medieval romance usually idealizes chivalry. So if it idealizes chivalry, we know that this is about the knight's uh, loyalty to God, loyalty to his lord, and loyalty specifically to his lady. So clearly, the Canterbury Tales is not about Palamon and Arcida's commitment to God. So we're going to take that and we're going to set it aside. If you look at the second, loyalty to his lord. Neither Arcida nor Palamon listen to what Theseus wants. They are two emotionally driven characters who believe that they will fall madly in love with Emily if they just present the best side of themselves, and Emily will swoon and fall madly in love with them, and they'll ride off into the sunset. As I have said multiple times, and when you look at the temples that the boys and Diana, when you look at the temples that the boys and Emily construct in part 3, you're going to see really what Chaucer's attempting to do with these particular allusions. So that's what's going to keep us moving forward in all of this. We also know that the chivalric ideas of benevolence, which is goodwill, brotherly love, yeah, that's funny, and the general politeness that a knight is supposed to have in any given circumstance, these also don't seem to apply to this at all. The knight is bound by a code of behavior, a set of conventional principles and expectations that will certainly drive him as a character to make better choices. But again, do we really see this? As you look at the particulars in the text of part 2, which we're going to do a lot of in class, I think these are some important details you want to tie together. A second major characteristic of medieval romance is the idea that it idealizes the hero knight and his noble deeds. Again, I find this tremendously ironic because there are no hero knights in this story. There's not a single noble character. We have two very selfish boys. We have a ruler in Theseus who seems to just enjoy putting these boys in a circumstance where they are suffering because they're, for lack of a better term, stupid. They are just overwhelmed with these uncontrolled feelings. So if I look at these characteristics that the medieval romance idealizes the hero knight and his noble deeds, the knight goes on a quest of high importance. The objects of the quest require great exertion on the part of the knight to make it happen. All these knights are doing is wasting away, trying to get a handle on their love, trying to get a handle on their emotion. Nothing really occurs except them sitting and becoming weepy and all torn up by their feelings in part 2. This is when Theseus finally steps in, when he finds them in the woods about to kill each other over the girl, and says, okay, if this is what you're going to do, we are going to over-dramatize. We are going to create a gigantic spectacle where you're all going to engage in this dramatic fight. You're going to erect temples that are described in part 3. All these huge things are going to occur. So I find all of these things incredibly significant. So the question I want to leave you with here is, so far, how has Chaucer mocked, satirized these elements of medieval romance in his part 1 and part 2? Now, the flipped lesson here is only about 5 or 6 minutes. But again, I want you to look at these characteristics and start really focusing on how you're going to tweak this and add it to your understanding of what's going on. So I thought I would take this opportunity to go back to the text, primarily on chapter 41, start looking at the development of Arcite as a character. Now, first of all, absolutely does he use his melancholy to his advantage. He is so wan, pale. He's so wasted away from all of this time that he has spent pining away after Emily, yet never being able to see her because he's been exiled, that he looks completely differently. So he returns to court illegally, and as it says in here, right in the middle of page 41, he fell, I just lost it, he fell in service with a chamberlain who had his dwelling there with Emily. The man was cunning and was quick to see what work the servants did and which were good. For he was young and powerfully grown, a tall young fellow too, and big of bone, fit to do any work that was ordained. So Arcite takes it upon himself to get a job where he no longer, let me rephrase that, to get a job based upon the fact that he is strong, is everything that a noble knight should be, except the fact that he's dishonest, except the fact that he's breaking the rules. So to get access to Emily, he assumes a disguise. A major part of medieval romance is this idea of characters assuming a disguise to get themselves ahead. So Chaucer is not accidental in the fact that he makes Arcite develop a disguise. I also find it very significant. He calls himself Philostrate, but then look at the last 4 lines on page 41. It says, "Thus in a little while his fame had sprung both for good deeds and for a courteous tongue, and Theseus took him and advanced him higher, made him his personal and chamber squire." So Arcite, even though he was banished by Theseus, even though all these negatives show up in his character, Arcite is advanced. But again, I find it so ironic. And I wrote, he's a noble knight, but only because of deceit. Arcite becomes noble, advances himself, but only because he is a deceitful human being. And I find this hugely ironic in our discussion of the Knight's Tale. And then on the top of 42, I wrote, he's deceitful, but he appears to be honest. So the last 2 or 3 lines of that first stanza on 42 says, he bore himself so well in peace and war that there was none Theseus valued more. I leave him there in bliss, although bliss is brittle, and turn to speak of Palamon a little. So it's that warning, hey, look at what he's done, but understand how tenuous and fragile this new character that Arcite has adopted is. I find very significant, and that's on the top of 42. More deceit, but this time for Palamon, and the fact that Palamon escapes because he drugs the jailer, and so therefore he's able to escape. But I think even more significant than the fact that Palamon is deceitful and is willing to cheat, he's labeled a traitor. So on the top of 43, we clearly understand that Palamon is a traitor to the throne. So we have Arcita the liar, and we have Palamon the traitor. So Chaucer develops 2 characters who are completely and entirely undeserving, and uses them to advance his short story. And of course, my notes say a couple things. Discuss the clash between Palamon and Arcita now, as it's different from where it was in part 1. And I also look at the classical references that the knight continues to bring up in the work, or Chaucer brings up through the knight, to make his larger points. Now, if I quickly go through what I have here in my notes, and you can see highlighting and you can see writing, this will certainly give me the opportunity to hit some other major points. So I wrote down in my notes that emotion is fickle, and this is that first full paragraph on page 44. That emotion just serves to send the boys in the wrong direction. About 7 or 8 lines down into that first paragraph, it says, just as upon a Friday, truth to tell, it shines one moment and then next rains fast. For thus can whimsical Venus overcast the spirits of her folk, just as her day Friday is changeable. And so too are they. Seldom is Friday like the rest of the week. And having sung, Arcite began to speak. Chaucer clearly says, emotion is fickle. What is a good emotion one moment will change very quickly the next. So again, very important as a detail. It may behoove you to pause the video at this point and write some of those notes down, making sure that you have it all taken care of. If I move to page 45, I wrote down that the loss of identity to courtly love and romance. So when we look at our two major characters, Arcite and Palamon, even though right now we're only having one of them in the story, I think it's a really interesting idea that Chaucer points out that these young men will sacrifice their sense of identity to these arbitrary rules of courtly love. And of course, you can go back to that list and you can write them down. So I think very important. So about 7 lines down, alas, fell Mars. Ah, Juno, stern of face, you have undone our lineage and our race, save for myself and Palamon, who dwells in martyrdom, poor wretch, in Theseus' cells. On top of this, to slay me utterly, the fiery dart of love so burningly thrusts through my faithful heart with dreadful hurt. My death was shaped for me before my shirt. You kill me with your eyes, my Emily. You are the cause that brings my death to me. And again, here's the book. So Arcite, again, as he's wasting away with all of these poetic, melancholy descriptions of how she doesn't love him, changing his identity, losing who he is for the sake of this unrequited love. Unrequited, UNREQUITTED. Unrequited or unreturned love. Next paragraph down. Palamon felt a cleaving in his heart as of a cold sword suddenly gliding through. He quaked with anger, hiding would not do now that he'd listened to Arcite's tale. So Chaucer creates this situation where one guy's standing outside and he's talking about his heart and he's emoting, he's all over the floor and it's just terrible. And Palamon is sitting there eavesdropping and he hears things he doesn't like, so he absolutely loses his stuff and they just become stupid. I wrote down in the margin right here that jealousy causes stupid action. Boys get dumb when they become jealous, and because they are stupid and because they are jealous, they engage in this hand-to-hand battle and they're going to kill each other. And wait a minute, Theseus just happens to ride by and he says, no, we're going to do something much more significant here. Now, of course, I'm skipping a couple of pages. We have a reference to Cupid on the bottom of page 46. On the top of page 47, we have clearly that passion destroys everything. Because these boys cannot control their emotions, they get themselves in trouble. On 46, it says, O Cupid, Cupid lost to charity, O realm that brooks no fellow king in thee. Well is it said that neither love nor power admit a rival even for an hour. Those last 4 lines on 46 and then that top line on 47 Because they are uncontrolled with their emotions, it destroys everything. Well is it said that neither love nor power can share, admit a rival. And again, this takes me to the bottom of 47. There's this dramatic battle. It's really all for show. Again, Deus Ex Machina. It's just moving us forward. Just plot development. And poof, Theseus on page 48, first stanza. Thus must explain why mighty Theseus found a sudden wish to hunt with horse and hound, especially the hart in early May. About his bed there never dawned a day. So the boys are ready to kill each other. They're engaging in hand-to-hand combat, and poof, Deus Ex Machina. Theseus happens to get his whole group together, and he wants to go for a ride in the exact same woods where these two boys who have been forbidden to interact with each other are going to engage in hand-to-hand combat. So on the bottom of 48, it says, last 6 lines, glancing towards the sun, he thereupon beheld Arcita fighting Palamon. They fought like boars in bravery. There go the shining swords encircled to and fro, etc., etc. So Theseus confronts the boys. On page 49, there is a long and extensive recap of what's occurred in the story. And everything is just going to just fall completely apart. But here's Chaucer's genius. Chaucer's genius is on the top of page 52. He has Queen Hippolyta intervene. The woman who has a much stronger sense of balance and a stronger sense of what's going on interferes. And she says, I readily forgive the whole affair, both at the queen's request that on her knees petitions and my sister Emily's, but you shall swear to me and give your hands upon it never to attack my lands or levy war on me by night or day. So because the queen intervenes, Theseus says, you know what, I'm going to calm down and I'm going to say, okay, we're going to forgive the two of you for right now. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to set up a ceremonial conflict. We're going to give you X amount of time to raise your armies, to build your temples, and to do all of these kinds of things. So on the bottom of page 52 here, it talks about how they're making a ceremonial battle. Everything is now going to be ultimately staged. The agreement is rather simple. The boys are going to put together this gigantic, huge battle. Emily is a trophy to be won. She has no sort of significant identity. As a matter of fact, she is marginalized as a human being. She is she's objectified. She's an object to be won. I think there's a huge modern sort of commentary we can make on this. And then the last stanza, the boys are stupidly driven by their passion. The last stanza above part 3, boys are stupidly driven by their sense of passion. And again, right down here, I relate this back to chivalry and how it functions. So there's a lot. Plot-wise, that's on you. You got to read it and figure out ultimately where you're going to be with these details. But again, this gives you an opportunity to look at some significant elements as you move forward. So, good luck, Godspeed. This is going to be due Tuesday, so make sure that you're moving forward.